Hello, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy, and this is Jimmy. We're about to tackle, in my opinion, one of the most wonderful essays, documents ever written, The Meditations of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antonius. What we're going to be reading is the translation by George Long. This is Meditation 1. This is first-person narration. He's writing kind of like a diary. These are his meditations when he was at war. We're going to learn about that in the analysis. But let's get started. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius Antonius. From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and the government of my temper. Notice the brackets here. The brackets are there because he's inserting the brackets. And he's saying that there is no verb in this section connected with the word. So George Long will put notes on the bottom every now and then. I encourage you to read them with me. I will point out some of them. But since this is the first sentence of the book that we're reading, and I always told you that the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page of anything that Jimmy reads is very, very important. We're going to take 1 second to look at this again. From my grandfather, Verus, bracket, I learned, close bracket, good morals and the government of my temper. Now remember, George Long is translating this from Marcus Aurelius. So since there's no verb, he gave it the verb that I learned. But if you read it without the verb, as an example, from my grandfather, Verus, good morals and the government of my temper. Something is implied there, some type of verb. And George Long, the implication, the verb he chose is that he learned, that Marcus Aurelius learned, because this first meditation is where he's giving credit to everybody who taught him to be the person he is. So let's continue. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. From my mother, piety and benevolence and abstinence, not only from evil deeds, but even from evil thoughts, and further, simplicity in my way of living, far removed from the habits of the rich. Note these little arrows that Jimmy gives you to pay attention to those particular things. What's benevolence? It's a noun that means the act of doing good. So this is what his mother taught him. From my great-grandfather, and there's a footnote here, Catillus Servius, perhaps, George says perhaps, right? He doesn't say it's definitely that. He says perhaps. Remember, when people translate anything, they're making judgment calls on the words. So let's accept George. George has been around for a long time, as you'll see. From my great-grandfather, not to have frequented public schools and to have a good teachers at home and to know that on such things a man should spend liberally. Now, isn't that an interesting observation today? Right? Don't frequent public schools. You see reading scores are falling. Oh, let's continue. From my governor to be neither the green nor of the blue party at the games in the circus, nor a partisan either of the Paramalius or of the Sectarius at the gladiator fights. In other words, don't choose sides. From the governor, him, pronoun, to, I learned endurance of labor and to want little and to work with my own hands and not to meddle with other people's affairs and not to be ready to listen to slander. So far, so good. From Diognetus, and he puts another footnote here, in the works of Justinius, there is a printed letter to one Diognetus, whom the writer names most excellent. So from this person, not to busy myself, not to Parlimus is a type of gladiator. So these are like modern day political parties. So he's saying from the governor, don't choose one side or the other, just be in the middle. Which, by the way, Aristotle teaches us, right? From Diognistus, not to busy myself about trifling things, and not to give credit to what was said by miracle workers and jugglers about incantations and the driving away of demons and such things. And not to breed quails for fighting. Brackets, see the brackets? That's George putting in the brackets. Nor to give myself up passionately to such things. And to endure freedom of speech. And to have become intimate with philosophy. And to have been a hearer, first of Bacchius, and then of Tantidus, and then of Marcenius. And to have written dialogues in my youth. And to have desired a plank bed and skin, and whatever else of the kind belongs to the Grecian discipline. He learned all that from the governor, huh? From Rusticis, and he's got a footnote here. This is a Stoic philosopher who Marcus Aurelius, valued highly. So you're going to find out that Stoicism is part of what makes Marcus Aurelius. But we'll talk about that in the analysis. From Rusticius, I learned the impression of my character required improvement and discipline. And from him, Rusticius, I learned not to be led astray to sophistic emulation, nor to writing on speculative matters, nor to delivering little hortatory orations, nor to showing myself off as a man who practices much discipline, or does benevolent acts in order to make a display, and to abstain from rhetoric and poetry and fine writing, and not to walk about in the house in my outdoor dress, nor to do other things of the kind, and to write my letters with simplicity, like the letter which Rusticius wrote from Senecia to my mother. And with respect to those who have offended me by words or done me wrong, to be easily disposed to be pacified and reconciled, as soon as they have shown a readiness to be reconciled, and to read carefully, and not to be satisfied with a superficial understanding of a book, nor hastily to give my assent to those who talk overmuch. And I am indebted to him, who's him, Rusticius, for being acquainted with the discourses of Epictetus, pardon my pronunciation of these very difficult names, which he communicated to me out of his own collection. So he had a relationship with this guy, right? He taught him Stoicism. You get the point now that what he's doing is he's really telling you some of the things, some of his beliefs, some of his lessons that he learned from other people that he tries to practice. And we're going to look at that in the analysis. You should be taking notes. From Apollonius, and George gives us a note that Apollonius came to Rome in the time of Pius to be Marcus's preceptor. He was a rigid Stoic. From Apollonius, I learned freedom of will and undeviating steadiness of purpose, and to look to nothing else, not even for a moment, except to reason. And to be always the same in sharp pains on the occasion of the loss of a child or in a long illness. In other words, to be the same, don't show your emotions. And to see clearly in a living example that the same man can be both most resolute and yielding, and not peevish in giving his instruction. And to have had before my eyes a man who clearly considered his experience and his skill in expounding philosophical principles as the smallest of his merits. And from him, Apollonius, I learned how to receive from friends what are esteemed favors without being either humbled by them or letting them pass unnoticed. It's important to know how to accept gifts, right? From Sextus, and George gives us a note who Sextus is the grandson of Plutarch, or a nephew, as some say. So remember, he's not saying this is definitely who this is. He's probably more of a grandson. He's interpreting who this. There are a lot of people named Sextus. Marcus Aurelius says, from Sextus, I learned, notice he skips the verb here, a benevolent disposition and the example of a family governed in a fatherly manner, and the idea of living comfortably to nature, and gravity, but without affection, and to look carefully after the interests of friends, and to tolerate ignorant persons and those who form opinions without consideration. There's a nice note there. We'll have to look at that, what that says. He had the power of readily accommodating himself to all, so that the intercourse with him was more agreeable than any flattery. This guy Sextus. And at the same time, he was most highly venerated by those who associated with him. And he had the faculty both of discovering and ordering in an intelligent and methodical way the principles necessary for life. And he never showed anger or any other passion, but he was always entirely free from passion and also most affectionate. And he could express approbation without noisy display, and he possessed much knowledge without ostentation, without showing off. Boy, wouldn't you like to meet somebody like that nowadays? From Alexander, and here he says Alexander was a grammaticus, a native of Peragdion. He wrote a commentary on Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the rhetorician Aristides wrote that Alexander in a funeral, wrote on his funeral oration. So from Alexander, not Alexander the Great, the grammarian, to refrain from fault finding. So don't find fault. Not in a reproachful way, to chide those who uttered any barbarous or solistic and strange-sounding expression, but dexterously to introduce the very expression which ought to have been used. In other words, don't interrupt, but just politely tell him what word he should have used. And in a way of answer or giving confirmation or joining in an inquiry about the thing itself, not about the word or by some other fit suggestion. From Fronto, who's Fronto? Okay. Cornelius Fronto was a rhetorician. Rhetorician, you'll find out these are people who were learned people who wrote in those days in Rome. I learned to observe what envy and duplicity and hypocrisy are in a tyrant, and that generally those among us who are called patricians are rather deficient in paternal affection. This is an interesting paragraph. Fronto. He was in great favor with Marcus. Marcus liked him. There's letters between him and Fronto. We're not going to read the letters necessarily, but that's important. George thought it's important to make a note of that so we know. And what did he learn from Fronto? To observe what envy, duplicity, and hypocrisy are in a tyrant. From Alexander the Platonic, I learned, not frequently nor without necessity, to say to anyone or to write in a letter that I have no leisure. In other words, he learned from this guy to never say he has, oh, I have no time. You've met people like that? Nor continually to excuse the neglect of duties required by our relation to those with whom we live by alleging urgent occupations. This is unbelievable. I told you in the beginning, this is one of the most exciting readings we'll be doing together. There's a lot here. There's a lot here. From Catullus, and here he says this is a Stoic philosopher. You see what I mean about Marcus Aurelius being Stoic? He's a Stoic. A lot of Stoic guys play an influence on him. So from Catullus, I learned, notice George is leaving the verb out. If we go back to the beginning and we look at the beginning for a moment, let's do that for one quick second. He put in brackets here, he learned good morals and the government of my temper. And now if we go back to what we were reading, where were we? I think we were here. From Catullus, you see, he doesn't use the brackets all the time because he's rolling, right? But he wanted you to know that that's what the verb is, that Marcus Aurelius learned from Catullus, not to be indifferent when a friend finds fault, even if he should find fault without reason, but to try to restore him, his friend, to his usual disposition, and to be ready to speak well of teachers, as it is reported of Domitius and Athenotus, and to love my children truly. And from my brother's service, his brother he says the word brother may not be genuine. Antonius had no brother. So he says this may not be his real brother. But I want you to remember, because I haven't told you this yet, but Marcus Aurelius was a warrior. He was a general. He was an emperor, but he was a warrior. And warriors refer to their fellow warriors as brothers, even in these days. Now, George Long, did not say that. Did not say that. But I'm telling you that George says this may not be genuine. I'm going to argue with George. This is genuine. This is his brother's service, means a fellow warrior. I learned to love my kin and to love truth and to love justice. And isn't that what your fellow warriors teach you? And through him, I learned to know Therus, Helvetius, Cato, Dion, Brutus. So George puts a note in and says, who are these people? They're the lives of Cato's, blah, 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 blah. And from him, his brother, right, I learned the idea of a polity in which there is the same law for all. Polity is a form of civil government or constitution. A polity administered with regard to equal rights and equal freedom of speech, and the idea of a kingly government which respects most of all the freedom of the governed. Now that's going to sound to all of us fairly familiar if you read the Constitution of the United States. And you're going to say, well, Jimmy, isn't that a contradiction? Because in those days, Rome enslaved the people that they conquered. Perhaps. But the important thing is the argument, as Albert Camus says, is to make you think. In other words, this idea of equal rights, equal freedom of speech, a government that respects most of the freedom, most of all the freedom of the governed. This was written way, way long ago. We're going to talk about this is way long ago, way before the Constitution. I learned from him also consistency and undeviating steadiness in my regard for philosophy. Philosophy played a big role in the Emperor Marcus Aurelius's life, as it did in many learned people in these days. And a disposition to do good and to give to others readily, and to cherish good hopes, and to believe that I am loved by my friends. And in him, who's him? Remember who we're talking about here? Service, his brother, his fellow warrior. I observe no concealment of his opinions with respect to those whom he condemned, and that his friends had no need to conjecture what he wished or did not wish, but it was quite plain. A plain-spoken man, his brother, right? From Maximus, who's Maximus? Claudius Maximus, another Stoic philosopher. Look at that. I learned self-government and not to be led aside by anything, and cheerfulness in all circumstances, as well as in illness. In other words, always just be cheerful. And Stoicism, as you'll find out, most of the times they try to accept things as they are. We'll talk about that throughout this reading in the analysis. And a just admixture in the moral character of sweetness and dignity, and to do what was set before me without complaining. How many of us do that these days? Jimmy better put a note there. Do what was set before me without complaining. I observed that everybody believed that he thought as he spoke, and that in all that he did, he never had any bad intention. And he never showed amazement. Who's he? Maximus. He never showed amazement and surprise, and he was never in a hurry. And he never put off doing a thing, nor was perplexed nor dejected, nor did he ever laugh to disguise his vexation. Do you know people who laugh to hide their vexation? It's an important point. Let me mark that. Nor, on the other hand, he was ever passionate or suspicious. In other words, he sounds kind of dull, doesn't he? I don't think so. He was accustomed to do acts of beneficence. Remember, that's what his mother taught him. And he was ready to forgive. And he was free from all falsehood. Can you imagine that? Wouldn't that be great to write on your tombstone? He was free from all falsehood, never lied. And he presented the appearance of a man who could not be diverted from right, rather than of a man who had been improved. I observed, too, that no man could ever think that he was despised by Maximus, or ever venture to think himself a better man than Maximus. He, Maximus, had also the art of being humorous in an agreeable way. The art of being humorous in an agreeable way. Isn't that an interesting characteristic? In my father, his father, Antonius Pius, he meant his adoptive father, his predecessor, the Emperor Antonius Pius. I observed mildness of temper and an unchangeable resolution in the things which he had determined after due deliberation, and no vainglory. So instead of he learned, he observed in those things which men call honors, and a love of labor and perseverance, and a readiness to listen to those who had anything to propose for the common weal, for the common good, and undeviating firmness in giving to every man according to his deserts. In other words, he observed that he was just, and a knowledge derived from experience of the occasions for vigorous action and for remission. And I observed that he, my father, adoptive father, had overcome all passion for boys, and he considered himself no more than another citizen. And there's a footnote. He uses a word, and he gives us the word. See Gap taker's note. considered himself no more than any other citizen. And he released his friends from all obligation to sup with him or to attend him of necessity when he went abroad. And those who had failed to accompany him by any reason of urgent circumstances always found him the same. I observed, too, that his habit of careful inquiry in all matters of deliberation and his persistency, and that he never stopped his investigation, through being satisfied with appearances which first presented themselves. He didn't stop short. And that his disposition was to keep his friends and not to be soon tired of them, nor yet to be extravagant in his affection, and to be satisfied on all occasions and cheerful, and to foresee things a long way off, and to provide for the smallest without display, and to check immediately popular applause and all flattery, and to be watchful over the things which were necessary for the administration of the empire, and to be a good manager of the expenditure, and patiently to endure the blame which he got for such conduct. And he was neither superstitious with respect to the gods, nor did he court men by gifts or trying to please them or by flattering the populace. But he showed sobriety in all things and firmness, and he never any mean thoughts or actions, nor love of novelty. Wouldn't you like to be saying this about the people in the government today? Because this guy was the emperor. And the things which conduce in any way to the commodity of life and which fortune gives an abundant supply, he used without arrogance and without excusing himself, so that when he had them, he enjoyed them without affectation. And when he didn't have them, had them not, he didn't want them. No one could ever say of him that it was either a sophist. Sophist was a sophist, a paid teacher of philosophy, an ancient popular thought with moral skepticism. In other words, he was a paid speaker. Or a homebred bracket. That's George's interpretation. Flippant slave or a pedant. But everyone acknowledged him to be a man ripe, perfect, above flattery, able to manage his own and other men's affairs. Besides, he honored those who were true philosophers, and he did not reproach those who pretended to be philosophers, nor yet was he easily led by them. Philosophy, remember, is going to be very important. He was also easy, and we're going to talk about that word philosophy in some of the analysis. He took a reasonable care of his body's health. I'm sorry, let me skip this sentence. He was also easy in conversation, and he made himself agreeable without any offensive affectation, pretending. So happy to see you. That's affectation. He took a reasonable care of his body's health, not as one who was greatly attached to life, nor out of regard to personal appearance, nor yet in a careless way, but so that through his own attention, he was very seldom stood in need of a physician's art or of medicine or external application. He was most ready to give without envy to those who possessed any particular faculty, such as that of eloquence or knowledge of the law, or of morals, or of anything else. And he gave them his help, that each might enjoy. Now remember, here's 2 pages of what he's been observing about his father, the prior emperor. Would you say he liked him? I would say he admired him. He's telling you the good side. Well, there's 2 sides to every story, Jimmy. Well, maybe, maybe not. That he might enjoy reputation according to his deserts. And he always acted conformably to the institutions of his country, without showing any affectation of doing so. In other words, he wasn't a hypocrite. He didn't pretend. He wasn't full of crap. You understand? You know what I'm talking about? When people pretend to show, oh, God, blah, 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 right? Further, his father was not fond of change nor unsteady, but he loved to stay in the same places and to employ himself about the same things. And after his paroxysms, right? Paroxysms of headache, he came immediately fresh and vigorous as usual occupations, because he had a headache sometimes. His secrets were not many, but very few and very rare. And these only about public manners. And in other words, he was discreet, right? And he showed prudence and economy in the exhibition of the public spectacles and of the construction of public buildings and his donations to the people. And in such things, for he was a man who looked at to what ought to be done, not to the reputation, his own reputation, but what is got by a man's act. He did not take the bath at unreasonable hours. He was not fond of building houses, nor curious about what he ate, nor about the texture and color of his clothes. He was in vain, nor about the beauty of his slaves. There's a note here. He had beauty of his slaves. What does that mean? This passage is corrupt and the exact meaning is uncertain. That's what George Long says. Think about that. Nor was he worried about the beauty of his slaves. I don't know, but I think we can figure that out for ourselves right now. If you believe, now slavery was accepted in those days, right? Well, Jimmy, didn't you say they believed in equal for everybody? Yeah, of course. But they still had slaves. So if you own something, you take care of something. The beauty of his slaves. He wasn't what? He wasn't fond of doing this, curious about what he ate, the texture of his clothes, nor about the beauty of his slaves. He wasn't vainglory, right? He wasn't vain. His dress came from Laurium, his villa on the coast, and from Lavernium generally, too. This was a villa on the north of Rome, and there Antonius was brought up, and he died there. Antonius is really Marcus Aurelius. George likes to use his last name. Most people know him as Marcus Aurelius. This also is corrupt. In other words, it's not clear writing. He can't translate it. He's guessing. We know how he behaved to the toll collector at Tusculum who asked his pardon, and such was all his behavior. We know how he behaved. We don't know, and I don't know if George tells us, but I'm going to say we know how his father behaved towards that when he asked his pardon for whatever. And so he was a fair man. There was in him nothing harsh, implacable, or violent, nor, as one may say, anything carried to the sweating point. He didn't sweat the details. But he examined all things severally, as if he had an abundance of time and without confusion, in an orderly way, vigorously and consistently. I wish I possessed that trait in my youth. I was always in a rush. And that might be applied to him, which is recorded of Socrates. Socrates, this is one of Plato's dialogues, right? Socrates was a wise, wise man. We're going to read some of Plato, if we haven't already. That he was able to both abstain from and to enjoy those things which many are too weak to abstain from and cannot enjoy without excess. He had willpower. But to be strong enough both to bear the one and to be sober in the other is the mark of a man who has a perfect and invincible soul, such as he showed in the illness of Maximus. I don't know. I wish I met that guy. To the gods, I am indebted. This is Marcus Aurelius saying, for having good grandfathers, good parents, a good sister, good teachers, good associates, good kinsmen and friends, and nearly everything good. Further, I owe it to the gods that I was not hurried into any offense against any of them. This reminds me of a line from Moby Dick where Ahab says, Ahab is chasing the white whale. That's the whole book. We're going to read that one day, if we haven't already. I would strike the sun if it insulted me. That's one of the lines from Herman Melville's Moby Dick that Ahab says, I would strike the sun if it insulted me. So Marcus Aurelius is saying he was never hurried into offense against any of the gods. Though I had a disposition which, if opportunity afforded it, might have led me to do something of this kind. In other words, he had to control his temper, which he admitted to before, where he learned how to do that. But through their favor, who's there? The gods. There never was such a concurrence of circumstances to put me to the trial. He never cursed the gods. Can you imagine that? Further, I am thankful to the gods that I was not longer brought up with my grandfather's concubine. You know what that is, right? And that I preserved the flower of my youth, and that I did not make proof of my virility before the proper season. You know what he's saying here, ladies and gentlemen, right? Concubine, right, is a kept woman. His grandfather's concubine preserved the flower of his youth, but even deferred the time before he lost his virginity. And then, remember, he practiced abstinence. Well, Jimmy, there's no reason to practice abstinence nowadays. Well, we're going to talk about that. That I was subjected to a ruler and a father who was able to take away all pride from me and to bring me to the knowledge that it is possible for a man to live in a palace without wanting either guards or embroidered dresses or torches or statues or such like show. This is a very interesting statement. We should really look at that. I don't know why I didn't mark that. I'm marking it now. But that it is in such a man's power to bring himself very near to the fashion of a private person without being, for this reason, either meaner in thought or more remiss in action with respect to the things that must be done for the public interest in a manner that befits a ruler. I'm just like other people. I thank the gods. This is all thanking the gods, right? For giving me such a brother. The emperor had no brother except Verus, his brother by adoption. They were co-rulers. Who was able, by his moral character, to rouse me to vigorance over myself. Vigilance. And control, who at the same time pleased me by his respect and affection, and that my children have not been stupid or deformed in body. He's thanking the gods. And that I did not make any more proficiency in rhetoric, poetry, and the other studies in which I should perhaps have been completely engaged if I had seen that I was making progress in them. In other words, he didn't lose himself in his books. That I made haste to place those who brought me up in the station of honor, which they seemed to desire, without putting them off with the hope of my doing it some other time after, because they were then still young. And that I knew Apollonius, Rustus, Maximus, and that I received clear and frequent impressions about living according to nature and what kind of life that is, so that, so far as depended on the gods and their gifts and help and inspirations, nothing hindered me from forthwith living according to the nature though I still fall short of it through my own fault. Living according to nature, but I still fall short of it through my own fault. He's not blaming. See, when he falls short, he's not blaming other people. And through not observing the admonitions of the gods. And I may almost say their direct instructions, and that my body has held out so long in such a kind of life. We're going to discuss what kind of life he's talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a clue now. He's writing these meditations. This guy was at war most of the time when he was the emperor. He was fighting all the time. And these meditations were written on the battlefield. On the battlefield. So he's grateful to the gods that his body has held up so long and in such a kind of life, and that I never touch either benedicta, theoris, and that after having fallen into amatory passions, I was cured. Amatory. We're going to have to look that up. He was cured. In other words, he got sick, but he was cured. And though I was often out of humor with Rustus, I never did anything of which I had occasion to repent. And that though it was my mother's fate to die young, she had spent the last years of her life with me. And that he's thanking the gods for all this. And that whenever I wished to help any man in his need or any other occasion, I was never told that I had not the same means of doing so. And that to myself the same necessity never happened to receive anything from another. And that I have such a wife. And he goes, there's a little note here, the life of Antonius. See, life of Antonius. And that I have such a wife, so obedient, affectionate, simple, and that I had abundance of good masters for my children, and that remedies have been shown to me by dreams and by others, and against blood spitting and giddiness. He says this is all corrupt. George does. That's a note. In other words, he's thanking the gods that he's pretty much, in his opinion, normal. And that when I had an inclination to philosophy, I did not fall into the hands of any sophist. Sophist is a bullshit artist. Silver-tongued devil. And that I did not waste my time. I did not, on writers of histories, bracket, on writers of histories, or in the resolution of syllogisms, logic, or occupy myself without investigation of appearances in the heavens. And for all these things required the help of the gods and fortune. Among the Quadi at Granada, the Quadi are barbarians that lived in Bohemia or whatever, and Antonius, Marcus Aurelius, made a campaign against them. When he says among the Quadi at Granada, right? So there's a footnote. If these words are genuine, notice George uses the word if. Well, Jimmy believes there's no if about this. This guy's writing this on the battlefield. Marcus Aurelius may have written this first book during the war with them. And in the first edition of Antonius and in other older editions, the first three sections of the second book make the conclusion of the first book. Gadiger placed them at the beginning of his second book. This is another guy like George Long who does the translations. The reason you'll find out in the analysis why I chose George Long. In any case, this is an important footnote here. The Marcomannic Wars were a series of wars lasting from 166 to 180, right? 66, 76, right? 15 years. They were pitted the Roman Empire against Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, and Samaritan, They were related conflicts with several Germanic tribes, Gothic peoples on both sides, blah, 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 blah. Marcus Aurelius was in these campaigns. He fought in these campaigns. often at the front lines. I'm just telling you, this is very interesting. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to analyze this first meditations. Learn more about Marcus Aurelius by watching other meditations. There's a dozen at least, maybe 14. By watching more of our ongoing videos on the meditations, and be sure to visit and read other classics on this website with Jimmy. If you have an email question, you can email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. I look forward to your emails, and please join me for the analysis of this first meditation by Marcus Aurelius. I'm going to tell you right now that the analysis I'm going to give you starts with one sentence. Well, it starts with a couple sentences. It will change your life. If you stick with this guy is going to change your life.